Okay, let's unpack this. Tariffs.
Hmm.
It's one of those words, right? It gets thrown around constantly in headlines, political speeches.
Oh, absolutely. All the time.
We hear about them constantly.
Hmm.
Promises about bringing back jobs, warnings about, trade wars. We might even have a pretty strong opinion based on what we've picked up. But I always find myself wondering, what do we really know? Like, how do they
Yeah.
actually work in the real world? Which is often, let's face it, pretty messy and complicated.
Especially right now, 2025. Things feel incredibly dynamic, uncertain even.
Exactly. So today we want to dive into a question I've been thinking about a lot, and I bet many of you have too. What does the world get wrong about tariffs?
We're going to try and pull back the curtain a bit on the common myths versus, well, the often harsh realities. We'll use current events, solid data, really try to separate fact from fiction and give you a clearer picture.
What's really fascinating here, and I think often gets overlooked, is that while the basic idea of a tariff seems so simple,
Right.
and it's just a tax on imports, isn't it?
Yeah, sounds straightforward.
But the actual mechanisms, the way it plays out, it creates this huge, sprawling, interconnected web of effects. And it touches absolutely everything. I mean, from the price you actually pay for your groceries to the fate of entire industries, even the delicate balance of international relations and global stability. Tariffs have these incredibly far-reaching consequences.
Hmm.
So our goal today is really to dissect some of those widely held beliefs about these economic tools and see where the reality often drifts, sometimes quite far from that initial simplistic idea. It's definitely a complex topic, no doubt, but understanding the nuances is just critical right now in our current economic and political climate where trade policies are shifting so dramatically.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
And to help us navigate this complex terrain, we've gathered a whole stack of recent reports and analyses. We've looked at stuff from diverse sources, everything from like the Associated Press news, White House directives, to some really deep research from the Yale Budget Lab, and expert financial news analyses too.
Yeah, good mix.
It lets us put together, we think, a unique 2025 snapshot of how tariffs are truly playing out, complete with these unprecedented court battles and those immediate global reactions we're seeing. Our mission really is to give you a shortcut, a way to get genuinely well-informed without getting totally swamped by all the data, right? We want you to be enlightened by it, not overwhelmed.
Exactly.
So we'll use clear explanations, real-world examples that hopefully stick, and maybe a couple of helpful analogies to uncover some of those hidden impacts, those surprising truths you might not expect. Okay, so let's start with the absolute basics. Just in case anyone's new to this or, just needs a quick refresher, what exactly is a tariff?
Right, the fundamentals. Well, in the simplest terms, a tariff is basically a tax. It's levied on goods when they cross a national border. Think of it like a customs duty you pay.
Okay.
And the traditional goal, at least in theory, is often sort of twofold. First, make imported goods more expensive. The idea is that might encourage consumers and businesses to buy domestically produced goods instead.
Right, by local.
And second, sometimes it's just about generating revenue for the government. Simple as that.
Okay, that's clear. To make it maybe even clearer, let's try an analogy. How about this? Think of it like a border toll. Not for people driving cars, but for products.
I like that.
So, when a truck carrying, say, foreign-made televisions drives into the country, it has to stop and pay this specific toll, that's the tariff, before its cargo can be legally sold on our store shelves.
Yeah.
It's a way for a government to either make those foreign TVs less competitive by directly jacking up their price, or maybe just put a price on getting access to its market,
That's a perfect analogy, actually. And it really sets the stage for how dramatically this simple concept has been, well, completely upended in 2025. Because this year, that simple idea of a border tax has gotten tangled up in just an absolute whirlwind of policy shifts and, frankly, incredibly significant legal battles right here in the U.S.
It's nonstop.
It really has. The current environment is marked by this really aggressive, almost sweeping approach to implementing tariffs, particularly coming from the executive branch. And this has triggered a series of really high-stakes legal challenges. They're truly unprecedented in some ways.
Okay, so what's the key event we need to understand?
Well, a huge event that really defines this current landscape for us, and one we absolutely need to unpack, is the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit's ruling. It just came down this past Friday. And this court basically found that the president went too far. Their words, went too far by declaring national emergencies as the legal basis to impose these sweeping import taxes on, and this is a quote, almost every country on earth.
Wow. almost every country.
Yeah. And this landmark ruling, it largely upheld an earlier decision back in May by a specialized federal trade court down in New York. So it's a pretty significant check on executive power in this area.
Okay, so give us some context. How big were these tariffs we're talking about?
We're talking series scale. Think about President Trump's Liberation Day tariffs, announced back on April 2nd. These weren't just minor tweaks, you know. They included reciprocal tariffs of up to 50% on countries where the U.S. has a trade deficit, and alongside that, a 10% baseline tariff on, again, almost everybody else.
50% is huge.
It's massive. Now, some of those were later suspended for 90 days to allow for negotiations, kind of a temporary pause, maybe to get some specific concessions. But countries that didn't comply or, negotiate successfully faced these really significant levies. For example, Laos was hit with a 40% tariff. Algeria faced a 30% levy on its goods coming in.
And how did the president justify this legally? You mentioned national emergencies.
Exactly. He justified these broad taxes under a specific law. The 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act, people call it IEPA.
IEPA.
Oh, he declared that persistent trade deficits were a national emergency, arguing they threatened U.S. economic security. And look, this wasn't the first time he'd used IEP either. Earlier, back in February, he'd also used it to put tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China. Back then, he cited concerns about illegal immigration and drug flows as another form of national emergency. So it was a really, really expansive interpretation of what counts as an emergency under that law.
But the court pushed back on that interpretation.
They did, quite strongly. The court's reasoning for rejecting this extremely broad use of power was very clear and focused on the Constitution. They stated, and I'm quoting roughly here, that it seems unlikely that Congress intended to grant the president unlimited authority to impose tariffs.
Okay.
They specifically pointed out that the U.S. Constitution clearly gives Congress, not the president, the power to set taxes and regulate commerce. That's Congress's job. And the May Trade Court decision, the one this appeals court mostly upheld, had actually combined legal challenges from a whole bunch of businesses and states who were directly hit by these sudden, sweeping tariffs.
So what happens now? Are the tariffs gone?
Well, that's the immediate implication, and it's significant. The tariffs actually remain in place for now.
Okay.
They're still being collected pending a potential appeal to the Supreme Court. That appeal has to be filed before mid-October. But this decision just highlights this profound policy volatility, this uncertainty. For businesses, both here and overseas, trying to plan their supply chains or make investment decisions or even just figure out how to price their products.
It must be a nightmare.
It's incredibly difficult. This legal back and forth introduces this enormous amount of risk and unpredictability. It's basically a constitutional showdown, but one with very real-world economic consequences playing out right now.
So this fight isn't really just about, say, the specific tariff rate on steel or whatever, is it? It sounds like a much bigger question, like what's the actual scope of presidential power when it comes to trade policy itself? And how does that kind of fundamental uncertainty, this constant legal ping pong over who actually has the authority, how does that ripple through the global economy? What are the practical impacts of that uncertainty on businesses everywhere, big and small? And, on us as consumers wondering about prices down the line, it really makes you wonder how anyone can plan effectively in this climate.
That's such a crucial point, because history really does offer some, pretty stark lessons here about how quickly policy intentions can just diverge from economic realities, often leading to significant unintended consequences. Governments often put tariffs in place with, seemingly clear and maybe even good intentions, maybe protect a domestic industry, create some jobs.
Sounds reasonable on paper.
Right. But the actual mechanisms are just far more complex. The outcomes can be surprisingly different, sometimes radically different from what they initially envisioned.
Okay, give us an example.
Okay, take the 1980s sugar tariffs. The goal seemed straightforward enough: protect American sugar producers, make imported sugar prohibitively expensive.
Right. Sounds like it would help them.
But what actually happened was this profound reshaping of an entire industry. Prices for domestic sugar, they spiked dramatically, and that forced major U.S. food and beverage companies, think Coca-Cola, Pepsi, the big guys, to scramble for cheaper alternatives. They couldn't just absorb those higher sugar costs. Their whole business model depended on it. So they made this massive industry-wide switch to high fructose corn syrup, HFCS.
Right. HFCS.
Yes. And this wasn't just some minor recipe tweak. It fundamentally reshaped the agricultural landscape, right? It gave a huge boost to corn growers while permanently altering the demand for sugar. And you could even argue it contributed to dietary changes among consumers.
Wow.
It's just a classic illustration of how tariffs can have these unforeseen systemic consequences, not just on the industry they directly target, but on entire ecosystems of businesses that rely on those imported inputs.
Okay, that's a powerful example.
Yeah.
Any others?
Oh, definitely. Another classic case, and one that sounds maybe eerily familiar today, is the 2002 Bush steel tariffs. President George W. Bush imposed those tariffs with the explicit goal of protecting struggling American steel producers. Again, seems like a clear, maybe noble goal.
Protect American jobs.
Exactly. However, these tariffs, as many economists actually predicted at the time, largely backfired. The industries that depended on steel as a crucial input, and think about massive sectors like auto manufacturing, construction, appliance makers, they suddenly faced significantly higher costs for their basic raw materials.
Right, the downstream industries.
Precisely. This downstream pain was immense. These sectors, which often employed far, far more people than the steel sector itself, they actually ended up shedding jobs. Their profits plummeted because their operating costs just skyrocketed.
So helping one hurt many others.
In effect, yes. While a small segment of the steel industry might have seen a temporary boost, the net effect on the broader economy was negative. It really illustrates how protecting one sector can inadvertently hobble many others. These historical examples set a clear, consistent precedent for the challenges we're seeing play out again today.
And didn't Trump's first administration also have major tariffs, particularly with China?
Absolutely. During his first term, President Trump launched a significant trade war, imposing tariffs on a wide range of Chinese goods. And pretty predictably, China retaliated with its own tariffs on U.S. goods. The result: higher costs for U.S. consumers, reduced profits for many U.S. businesses that relied on Chinese inputs or exported to China, and a noticeable slowdown in U.S. exports. It really demonstrated that these historical lessons about retaliation and downstream costs continue to be relevant.
And speaking of history rhyming, or maybe even repeating itself, this legal battle shaking up 2025 really does feel like a landmark moment. It shows just how much this current aggressive approach to tariffs is being challenged. So building on that court decision we talked about, the one challenging the president's broad use of emergency powers, it's really important to understand what this means for other trade policies, right?
Yeah.
Because this decision, while it's huge, it doesn't actually wipe the slate clean for all the tariffs that are out there, does it?
No, absolutely not. That's a critical distinction.
Right. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit's ruling on Friday essentially said President Trump wasn't legally allowed to declare national emergencies and impose import taxes on almost every country on Earth. Big statement. And like you said, it upheld that earlier May ruling from the Specialized Trade Court. So it's a major moment in defining executive power in trade. Now, the court's decision seems pretty broad in its reach. It covers those tariffs Trump slapped in April on almost all U.S. trading partners.
Right.
And also those earlier levies he imposed on China, Mexico, and Canada.
Correct. All the ones justified under that Emergency Powers Act, i.e. EPA, citing things like trade deficits, immigration, drug flows, all framed as national emergencies.
Okay. And this seems like a really crucial detail for everyone listening, this ruling does not cover every single tariff Trump has imposed.
Right. That's exactly right. It's very specific.
It specifically does not apply to other tariffs, like the ones on steel, aluminum, and potentially autos. Why not those?
Because those were put in place under a different legal authority. Specifically, Section 232 of the 1962 Trade Expansion Act. That law deals with national security implications, a different justification pathway.
Okay, Section 232. Got it.
And the ruling also doesn't affect his first-term China tariffs. Those were imposed after these lengthy investigations into alleged unfair trade practices using yet other legal statutes.
So what we've got is this really complex kind of patchwork legal landscape. Some tariffs are standing firm under different laws, while this big group imposed under IEPA is now under direct constitutional challenge.
Exactly. It's not a simple all tariffs are invalid situation at all.
And the government's reaction to this ruling sounds pretty intense.
Oh, it was. To put it mildly, it was dramatic. The Justice Department used some pretty stark language, warning that actually revoking these specific tariffs could lead to financial ruin for the United States.
Financial ruin. Why?
Because of the sheer amount of money that's already been collected under these tariffs, potentially $159 billion by July. If the ruling is ultimately upheld by the Supreme Court, the government might have to refund all that money to the importers who paid it.
$159 billion. Wow. That's a huge potential liability.
It's staggering, and President Trump himself immediately vowed to appeal the decision to the Supreme Court, stating, and this is a direct quote, that such an outcome would literally destroy the United States of America. So yeah, the financial and political stakes here are absolutely immense.
Okay. But even with this big ruling against the broad use of IEPA, it's not like the president has no tools left for import taxes.
Right.
Right. Are there other ways?
No, he's not left completely without options. He still has alternative legal pathways, but they are considerably more limited, more constrained.
Like what?
Well, for instance, there's the Trade Act of 1974. It allows for tariffs, but it restricts them to a maximum of 15% and only for a duration of 150 days, and specifically targeted at countries with large trade deficits, much narrower.
15% and 150 days.
Yeah.
Very different from 50% indefinitely.
Very different. Another option is that Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, the one used for steel and aluminum. But that requires a formal investigation by the Commerce Department into actual national security risks. It's not just based on presidential discretion declaring an emergency.
So the tools are still there, but they come with more strings attached, more hoops to jump through.
Exactly. More stringent constraints, a higher bar for justification. It really reins in that broad discretionary power that was challenged by the court. So, considering these historical examples where we saw well-intentioned tariffs often lead to these really unexpected negative consequences, and then you add in this current legal pushback, challenging the very foundation of how this executive trade power was being used. It really highlights a core tension, doesn't it? How much does political will, or maybe just really compelling national messaging, how much does that override, or at least attempt to override, the fundamental economic realities when governments choose to implement tariffs? That feels like a central question here.
That's a perfect setup because it leads us right into the first and maybe the most persistent major misconception about tariffs, the one you hear all the time. Foreigners pay the tariffs.
Ah, yes, that old chestnut.
That sounds great, right? Politically, it's such an appealing idea. We tax their goods, they foot the bill. What's not to like?
If only it were that simple. The reality and the hard data consistently bears this out is quite different. While yes, technically the tariff is paid by the importer, that's usually a domestic company bringing goods into the country right at the border.
Okay.
Most of that bill, the actual economic burden, ultimately lands right here at home. On domestic consumers and other domestic businesses.
How does that work exactly? Walk us through it.
Okay, so the U.S. importer pays the tax to the U.S. government when the goods arrive. Now, to maintain their own profit margins, what do they typically do?
Pass the cost on.
Exactly. They pass those increased costs along their supply chain. Now, sure, maybe some foreign firms might cut their prices a tiny bit to try and stay competitive, and maybe some domestic retailers might absorb a fraction of the cost, especially for a short time, to avoid sticker shock for consumers.
But mostly.
But ultimately, the burden cascades down. It means consumers bear the brunt through higher prices on all sorts of goods. Or it means downstream businesses, the ones using those imported parts or materials, face thinner profits because their costs went up.
It's either higher prices for us or less profit for businesses here.
Or often a mix of both. The exact split, who absorbs how much, really depends on the specific market dynamics. How sensitive is demand to price changes? How much bargaining power do the buyers and sellers have? But almost always, a significant chunk of that bill comes home.
So back to our toll booth analogy from earlier.
Yeah.
It's like the truckers, the importers, they pay that toll up front to get the goods into the country.
Right.
But then you, the shopper, are the one who ultimately sees it reflected in higher prices. Maybe on that new smartphone, maybe just your weekly grocery bill, maybe the cost of a new car, or even just a pair of shoes. It's like this hidden tax on your wallet that you might not even consciously connect back to the tariffs here. It feels less direct than, say, a sales tax.
That's a great way to put it. It's often hidden in the final price.
And the data from 2025 really drives this home. It's not just theory. The Yale Budget Lab, they've been doing some rigorous analysis of these new tariffs.
Yeah, their work is really important here.
They estimate that consumers right now are facing an overall average effective tariff rate of 18.6%. Now, what does effective mean there?
It means that's the real sort of felt increase in price across the board due to all these tariffs combined after you factor in all the different rates and all the different products.
Okay, 18.6%. How does that compare historically?
That 18.6%. It's the highest effective rate since 1933. Way back, before consumers and businesses really had a chance to shift their buying habits in response.
Wow, since 1933.
Yeah. And even after some initial shifts happen, people find substitutes, maybe companies change suppliers. The average rate settles at 17.7%, still the highest since 1934. So these are historically high levels of effective taxation on imports.
Okay, put that 18% into dollars and cents for us. What does it mean for households?
This is where it gets really tangible. The Yale Budget Lab's analysis indicates that the overall price level, just from all these 2025 tariffs, rises by an average of 1.8% in the short run.
1.8% doesn't sound huge, maybe?
Well, that seemingly small percentage translates to an average per household income loss of a staggering $2,400 in 2025 dollars.
$2,400 per household. Okay, that's significant.
It really is. And even after some economic adjustments happen over time, the price increase settles at 1.5%, which still represents a substantial $2,100 loss per household every year.
And does this hit everyone equally?
No. And this is where it gets really interesting and frankly quite concerning. Tariffs are fundamentally a regressive tax.
Regressive meaning?
Meaning lower-income households get hit disproportionately harder. They feel a much greater pinch than wealthier households do.
How much harder?
The short-run burden on the first decile of income earners, that's the lowest 10%, is more than 3 times the burden on the top decile. We're talking an income loss of 3.5% for the lowest earners versus under 1.0% for the highest earner.
3 times the impact.
Yeah. Think about that. For families already struggling to make ends meet, an average annual cost of $1,300 for those households in the lowest decile is a massive blow to their budget. Now, for the top decile, the absolute dollar cost is higher, about $5,000, but it represents a much, much smaller percentage of their overall income. So it's far less of a burden, relatively speaking.
So that whole promise that foreigners pay, it just doesn't hold up when you look at the data. It's U.S. households, especially those with less disposable income, who are really bearing these costs.
That's what the evidence strongly suggests, yes. And this impact on household budgets, it leads us right into misconception number 2. The widely held belief that tariffs fix trade deficits.
Right, another common one. Impose tariffs, imports go down, deficit fixed. Simple.
If only. Again, it's an idea that resonates powerfully, sounds like common sense. But the reality is way more complex. Trade balances, fundamentally, are driven by much bigger macroeconomic factors.
Like what?
Specifically, things like a country's overall savings and investment gap. They aren't just a simple function of import taxes. If a country like the U.S. tends to save less than it invests, it typically runs a trade deficit, almost regardless of tariffs. Why? Because it needs to import capital from abroad to make up that difference.
Okay, so tariffs don't change that underlying saving and investment behavior.
Not fundamentally, no. What tariffs tend to do instead is primarily just rearrange where a country imports from, or maybe what types of goods get imported. So you might slap tariffs on goods from country A, right? Hoping to reduce your trade deficit with that specific country.
Makes sense.
But what often happens is that imports simply shift. Businesses find suppliers in country B or country C that aren't subject to the tariff. Or maybe domestic demand for the tariffed goods just goes unmet, or it's met but at a much higher price.
So you're not actually reducing the overall amount of imports necessarily.
Often not. It frequently just shuffles the deck. And this shuffling usually adds new logistics costs, new complexities to global supply chains, but it doesn't magically eliminate the overall deficit. So while the headline numbers for trade with one particular country might change, the overall U.S. trade deficit frequently remains stubbornly in place, just, reshuffled. It's like playing whack-a-mole. You hit one deficit, another one pops up somewhere else.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
It's exactly like squeezing a balloon, too. You push in on one spot, let's say tariffs on goods from country A, hoping to shrink imports from there.
Right.
But the air, which is like the underlying demand for those goods, it just bulges out somewhere else. Imports from country B and country C increase to fill the gap.
Yeah.
And like you said, it probably comes with added headaches, new logistics, different standards, maybe higher costs because you've disrupted the efficient supply chains you had before. You haven't made the balloon smaller. You've just changed its shape and probably made it harder to handle.
That's a perfect way to visualize it. The underlying volume, the deficit, often persists. Which brings us to our third misconception, and it's closely related. The promise that tariffs bring back jobs across the board.
The jobs argument. This is maybe the most politically powerful one, isn't it? Tariffs will revive American manufacturing, bring back jobs.
Absolutely. It's a very potent message. But again, the economic reality is just far more nuanced and often, frankly, disappointing compared to the promise. The reality is that tariffs are almost always surgical in their effects, even if they're applied broadly. What does that mean? Well, they might indeed protect some very specific upstream sectors.
Upstream,
Like, say, steel smelters or aluminum producers. They might see some benefit because foreign competition is reduced and demand for their domestic product goes up. Okay, potentially some job gains there.
but there's always a but, isn't there?
There usually is. The critical counterpoint is that these same tariffs frequently end up hurting much, much larger downstream sectors, the ones that rely on those protected inputs.
Like the steel-using industries you mentioned before.
Exactly. Think back to our 2002 steel tariff example. While maybe domestic steel producers got a temporary shield, think about how those higher steel costs slammed massive industries like automakers, appliance manufacturers, construction companies.
They use a lot of steel.
A ton. They suddenly face a significant increase in their basic raw material costs. That makes their own products more expensive to produce, less competitive, both here and globally. So the net employment effects, once you factor in this pervasive downstream pain, can be quite modest at best. And often they're actually negative.
Meaning more jobs lost in the downstream industries than gained upstream.
It's very possible, even likely in many cases. The number of jobs lost in those larger downstream industries can easily overshadow any jobs gained in the smaller, protected upstream sectors. It's a classic case of concentrated benefits for a visible few versus diffuse, but ultimately larger costs spread across the many.
And the 2025 data seems to back this up. The idea of across-the-board job growth isn't really happening.
No, the data from the Yale Budget Lab and also DW Business really underscores this point. It shows that this promise just isn't playing out as advertised. For instance, the Yale Budget Lab projects that U.S. real GDP growth for both 2025 and 2026 is actually going to be 0.5 percentage points lower each year because of these tariffs.
0.5% lower growth each year. That adds up.
It does, and in the long run, they project the U.S. economy will be persistently 0.4% smaller than it otherwise would have been. That translates to a staggering $125 billion annually in lost economic output, just gone. That's a huge drag on overall growth.
What about the jobs numbers specifically?
The labor market also takes a pretty significant hit according to their model. The unemployment rate is projected to rise 0.3 percentage points by the end of 2025, and an even bigger jump, 0.7 percentage points, by the end of 2026.
Higher unemployment.
And payroll employment, that's the total number of jobs on company payrolls, is estimated to be a staggering 505,000 lower by the end of 2025 than it would have been without these tariffs. 500,000 fewer jobs.
500,000. But wait, you sometimes hear reports that U.S. manufacturing is expanding. How does that square with these numbers?
That's a great point, and it highlights the need to look closely at the details. It's true, overall, U.S. manufacturing output is projected by Yale to expand slightly by 2.1%. And if you break it down, non-advanced durable manufacturing, things like basic metal products, furniture sees a decent 3.9% increase. Non-durable manufacturing, like food products, is up maybe 1.3%.
Oh,
okay.
I sense another but coming.
You sense correctly. Here's the crucial detail that often gets lost in the headlines. Advanced manufacturing, this includes high-tech industries like semiconductors, aerospace, specialized machinery, is actually projected to be down by 2.7%.
Down 2.7%. Why is that so significant?
Because advanced manufacturing often relies really heavily on these complex, globally integrated supply chains for specialized, high-value components. Tariffs just wreak havoc on these intricate networks. They make it harder, more expensive for these complex industries to operate. So tariffs can end up hurting the very sectors often associated with future economic growth, innovation, and high-skilled jobs.
Okay, so some gains in basic manufacturing, but losses in advanced manufacturing. And what about outside manufacturing?
Right. And these scattered gains in some parts of manufacturing are more than crowded out by contractions in other really vital sectors. Construction is projected down 3.6%, agriculture down 0.8%, mining and extraction down 1.4%.
So a net loss overall.
And adding to this picture, DW Business reported that the actual job creation numbers for July came in really weak. Only 73,000 jobs added, way below the forecast of 115,000. Plus, the number for the previous months, June and May, were sharply revised down to just 14,000 and 19,000 respectively. That sharp downward revision sent a pretty clear signal, according to DW, of a failure of the Trump tariff policies to deliver the promised broad job growth.
Okay, so the promise of universally bringing back jobs just isn't supported by the broad economic data we're seeing.
The data suggests it's much, much more complicated than that, with significant negative offsets. Which leads us neatly into our fourth common misconception. The idea that tariffs are quick leverage with no blowback.
Ah, the idea that you can just impose tariffs, use them like a hammer to force other countries to do what you want, and there won't be any negative consequences for you.
Exactly. That you can use them as this blunt instrument to force concessions and expect little to no negative repercussions for your own economy. It sounds appealingly tough, maybe.
Yeah, project strength.
But the reality, especially now in 2025, is that retaliation is now the norm. It's almost expected.
Meaning other countries hit back.
Almost invariably. When one country imposes tariffs, particularly broad ones like we've seen, its trading partners almost always respond. They hit back with their own retaliatory duties, often targeting politically sensitive goods from the first country. Or they initiate these targeted investigations into the goods coming from the tariff-imposing country.
So it becomes a tit-for-tat trade war.
Precisely. It creates this dangerous cycle of tit-for-tat actions that just destabilizes global trade, raises costs, increases uncertainty for businesses everywhere. Nobody really wins in that scenario.
Are there other forms of blowback besides direct retaliation?
Oh, yes. Companies often engage in what economists call front-loading shipments.
Front-loading?
Yeah, it means they rush to import huge quantities of goods before new tariff deadlines kick in, trying to beat the tax hike.
Okay. So you see a big surge in imports right before the tariff hits.
Exactly. It creates this artificial surge in trade volumes in the short term, makes it look like trade is booming, but it's just a temporary distortion.
And then what happens after the tariff is in place?
Well, once the tariffs take effect, trade volumes in those goods often slow down dramatically. Companies hold back, maybe they look for alternative suppliers, maybe demand drops because of the higher prices. This leads to market instability, these weird boom-bust cycles for specific product categories. We also see things like rules of origin checks tightening up significantly. That makes it harder for goods to qualify for any preferential trade treatment they might have had. And you see more scrutiny on complex transshipment through third countries as firms try to find ways, sometimes legally dubious ways, around the new barriers. All of this just adds friction, inefficiency, and cost to the global trading system.
Can you give us a concrete 2025 example of this retaliation dynamic?
Absolutely. A very relevant one is the European Union's recent duties imposed on China-made electric vehicles. The EU imposed them citing concerns about unfair Chinese subsidies distorting the market.
Okay. What happened next?
Almost immediately, China launched swift retaliatory probes, targeting key European agricultural exports like French brandy, Spanish pork, Danish dairy products, politically sensitive sectors in Europe.
Wow, that was fast. Brandy, pork, dairy. Classic retaliation targets.
It's a textbook example of how quickly that tit-for-tat cycle can begin. Now, interestingly, in situations like this, the negotiations often explore alternatives to just blunt tariffs.
Like what?
Like price undertakings. These are basically agreements where the exporting country, or maybe specific companies within that country, commit to selling their products, in this case, EVs, at or above a certain agreed minimum price, rather than facing an outright tariff.
So not a tax, but a minimum price agreement.
Right. It aims for a more predictable outcome, maybe avoids the full disruption of a tariff, though it still usually results in higher prices for consumers. But the point is, it still demonstrates that there are always consequences and responses. That idea of cost-free leverage is largely a myth in today's interconnected world. Which brings us to misconception number 5. The idea that tariffs are a reliable revenue engine for the government.
Right. Impose a tax on imports, government collects the money, helps the budget. Sounds straightforward.
It does sound appealingly simple. And look, initially, government revenues might indeed rise right after tariffs are imposed. You see those headlines, tariff revenue surges. It gives the impression of a successful new income stream.
Still waiting for the other shoe to drop.
Always. The reality is that this revenue stream is often far more volatile and unreliable than it first appears. Those initial high revenues often fall off quite sharply over time.
Why does the revenue fall off?
Several reasons. Imports of the tariffed goods might decline simply because they've become too expensive. Or, as we discussed, supply chains might reroute businesses, find suppliers in countries not subject to the tariffs. Or companies might successfully lobby for specific exemptions or carve-outs for their particular products or industries. Suddenly, that revenue base starts shrinking.
So exemptions and rerouting chip away at it.
Exactly. Plus, you have political tweaks, various carve-outs decided for political reasons, maybe temporary truces or pauses in tariff implementation during negotiations. All of this makes the revenue stream incredibly unpredictable for government budget planners. They can't really count on it long term.
And then there's the legal uncertainty we talked about earlier.
Precisely. Legal challenges, like the huge court case we've been discussing, add another massive layer of uncertainty. If those rulings stand, the government could be forced to refund billions of dollars in duties already collected. Or they might have to completely redesign the policies. Either way, it completely disrupts any expected revenue flow.
So what looks like a steady river of income can quickly turn into a trickle, or even flow backwards if refunds are required.
That's a good way to put it. It's just not a stable, reliable source.
Does the 2025 data show this volatility?
It absolutely does. DW Business reported that back in 2024, tariffs brought the U.S. nearly $50 billion in revenue in just the first half of the year. Okay. Then, in the first half of 2025, that number doubled to an impressive $100 billion. That led the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, to project maybe over $300 billion for the full year. Those are big attention-grabbing numbers, right?
$100 billion in half a year is huge. $300 billion projected. Wow.
Huge numbers. However, the Yale Budget Lab offers a really crucial counter perspective, looking at the longer term and the dynamic effects. They estimate that if the current 2025 tariffs were to stay in place indefinitely, they would, using conventional scoring methods, raise about $2.7 trillion over the next decade, 2026 to 2035.
$2.7 trillion. Still sounds massive.
It does, but and this is a really substantial, but they also estimate negative dynamic revenue effects totaling $475 billion over that same period.
Negative dynamic effects. What does that mean?
It means that the tariffs themselves slow down the overall economy. They reduce output, lead to fewer transactions, less overall economic activity, and all of that shrinks the tax base for other taxes as well. So the government collects less income tax, less corporate tax, less sales tax because the economy is smaller.
So the tariffs generate revenue directly, but they also shrink the economy, which reduces revenue from other sources.
Precisely. So when you factored in those negative dynamic effects, that $475 billion loss, the total dynamic revenue estimate drops from $2.7 trillion down to $2.2 trillion.
That's a $500 billion difference.
It's a huge difference. It perfectly illustrates just how unreliable and volatile these revenue projections can be. That initial surge in tariff revenue can be really misleading if you don't account for the broader economic slowdown they cause, which ultimately hits the government's overall bottom line. And finally, this brings us to misconception number 6. And this one is maybe the most fundamental. The idea that tariffs are just economics.
Meaning they're just about trade balances and jobs and revenue, and that's it.
Right. As if they exist in this purely economic bubble that could not be further from the truth in the modern world.
Okay, so what else are they about?
In today's global landscape, tariffs are deeply, deeply intertwined with geopolitics, national security, and domestic politics. They're far more than just simple economic levers. They're powerful, multifaceted tools that governments use to achieve a whole range of strategic objectives that go way beyond simple trade balances or job numbers.
Like what kind of strategic objectives?
Well, governments frequently use tariffs as a tool to try and de-risk their supply chains, especially in sectors they deem critical. Think semiconductors, electric vehicles, advanced batteries, pharmaceuticals.
So making sure they aren't too reliant on certain countries for essential stuff.
Exactly. They might target goods from specific countries, not just for purely economic reasons, but because they want to reduce reliance on a potential adversary or an unreliable partner for strategically important components. It's about resilience. Tariffs also serve as a direct response to industrial policies being implemented abroad. If one country feels another is unfairly subsidizing its industries, they might use tariffs to try and level the playing field, or maybe just retaliate against what they see as unfair practices.
All right. Geopolitics, industrial policy. What else?
Bargaining chips. Tariffs are often deployed as bargaining chips in broader international relations. They give a country leverage in diplomatic negotiations that might actually have nothing to do with the specific products being taxed. It's a way to apply pressure. So what this means is that the design and implementation of tariffs are rarely, if ever, purely about economic efficiency. They're used to signal a country's priorities. They can be used to reward allies and punish adversaries. And let's be honest, they are frequently deployed to mobilize voters around specific political narratives about national strength, economic independence, us versus them.
So politics plays a huge role.
An enormous role. And we can even see the impact of this broader political dimension reflected in the financial markets, which kind of act as a global confidence barometer.
How so?
Well, look at the U.S. dollar index in 2025. It measures the dollar's value against a basket of other major currencies. It experienced a really significant drop this year, falling from around 129 points at the start of the year down to 120 by June.
That's a noticeable drop. Was it unusual?
It was the steepest first-half drop for the dollar since way back in the early 1970s. And some experts attribute this directly to a loss of confidence in U.S. economic policy, stemming from these erratic, unpredictable trade measures.
How does a weaker dollar connect back to tariffs?
Well, a weaker dollar makes imports more expensive for U.S. consumers and businesses, kind of adding to the inflationary pressure from the tariffs themselves. On the flip side, it makes U.S. exports cheaper for foreign buyers, which could theoretically help exporters, but the overall volatility is disruptive. The bigger point is that it demonstrates how tariffs aren't just about goods and prices. They reflect on a country's perceived stability, its reliability, its strategic direction on the global stage. And that perception impacts everything from international investment flows to currency valuations. It's all connected.
Okay, so when trade policy becomes this unpredictable, this volatile, and when it's so tangled up with all these other non-economic factors like geopolitics and national security, what does that actually do to a country's reputation globally? What are the long-term, maybe even irreversible impacts of this constant policy whiplash on international relationships, on a country's ability to negotiate effectively in the future, on its overall standing in the world? It really makes you think about the ripple effects far beyond just the immediate economic numbers.
That is such a critical question as we look ahead, and it brings us right to our 2025 snapshot, which, as you said, is just characterized by this considerable policy whiplash and this pervasive uncertainty hanging over the global trade landscape.
Yeah, whiplash feels like the right word.
Definitely. U.S. policy this year has been incredibly volatile. We saw those sweeping baseline tariffs imposed on seemingly everyone. Then that was followed by these partial pauses and tweaks during negotiation periods. And then, boom, as we discussed in detail, that major appeals court ruling came down, finding that most of these broad 2025 tariffs actually exceeded presidential authority under IEPA.
So for businesses trying to operate in this, what's the takeaway?
Extreme volatility. The practical takeaway is that tariff rates, the exemptions list, the timelines, everything can shift incredibly rapidly based on a new executive order or the next turn in the court calendars. It makes long-term planning incredibly difficult, almost impossible in some cases. It forces companies into this constant reactive mode, often delaying crucial investment decisions because the rules of the game keep changing.
And we're seeing similar tensions elsewhere too, right? Like between the EU and China.
Absolutely. At the same time, we're seeing these heightened EU-China tensions playing out very visibly. Europe, as we mentioned, recently imposed new duties on China-made electric vehicles, citing concerns over unfair subsidies and market distortions.
And China retaliated.
True to the retaliation is the norm principle we talked about, China responded swiftly. They launched their own anti-dumping actions targeting specific, economically and politically significant EU agricultural products, French brandy, Spanish pork, Danish dairy.
Tit for tat, just like you said.
Exactly. It's a very real escalation with direct consequences for producers and consumers on both sides. Now, interestingly, in these high-stakes negotiations, both sides have apparently explored alternatives to just blunt tariffs.
Like those minimum pricing arrangements you mentioned.
Exactly. Minimum pricing arrangements or price undertakings. Essentially, agreements where, for instance, Chinese EV makers might commit to selling their vehicles in the EU market at or above a certain agreed-upon price floor.
What's the appeal of that approach?
Well, it offers maybe a degree of stability for businesses compared to an outright tariff. It addresses the core concern about undercutting due to subsidies without resorting to the full disruption of a broad tariff. But ultimately, it still usually means the consumer ends up paying a bit more. It's a managed trade outcome, not free trade.
Okay. So looking at the bigger picture, what's the global trade outlook for the rest of 2025 and into 2026?
Well, remember that front-loading effect we discussed. Companies rushing shipments earlier in the year might have temporarily boosted the trade volume numbers.
Right, trying to beat the deadlines.
But now forecasters widely expect slower goods trade growth as we move into late 2025 and stretch into 2026. This slowdown is often attributed to what some call an uncertainty tax.
Uncertainty tax.
Yeah, it's the economic costs associated with businesses just delaying investment because they don't know the rules, or rerouting supply chains, which is costly and inefficient, or simply hesitating to make commitments in the face of unpredictable trade policies. It creates this drag.
So a mixed picture globally. Resilience in some areas maybe, but this persistent friction and economic drag overall.
That seems to capture it well. A very mixed picture with significant headwinds from policy uncertainty.
In this kind of complex, volatile environment, it seems really important to understand who the relative winners and losers are likely to be, because these impacts are never spread evenly, are they?
No, absolutely not. The distributional effects are crucial. On the relative winners side, you might see some of those protected upstream producers benefiting. Certain domestic metals companies, maybe manufacturers of specific intermediate goods who suddenly face less foreign competition.
Okay, who else?
Maybe some import competing niches, especially where domestic companies have the capacity to quickly scale up production to meet demand once imports become more expensive. They could see some gains. Also, logistics firms, the ones that are clever enough to capitalize on the inevitable supply chain rerouting, finding new routes, new ports, new ways to move goods around the barriers, they could find new opportunities.
And maybe even entire countries.
Potentially, yes. Some countries might emerge as bridge hubs in these newly forming trade corridors. They could offer alternative sourcing locations or transit points, benefiting from the disruption elsewhere. And interestingly, some projections suggest the EU might actually see a tiny long-run GDP gain, like plus 0.1%, and the UK maybe plus 0.2%. Partly, this could be due to trade diversion, but also potentially benefits from things like a hypothetical US-UK trade deal becoming more attractive. It just shows how complex the global web is. Some can gain slightly from others' disruptions.
Okay, so those are potential relative winners. What about the losers? That list seems likely to be longer.
Unfortunately, yes. The relative losers list is often longer and typically includes sectors that are critical to the broader economy. Downstream manufacturers, the ones who rely heavily on imported inputs again, think of everyone who uses steel, aluminum, semiconductors, chemicals. They are consistently among the hardest hit. They face significantly higher costs for their essential raw materials, which makes them less competitive.
Who else is vulnerable?
Small importers. Companies working on really thin margins often find it incredibly difficult, maybe even impossible, to absorb these sudden added tariff costs. It can force them out of business entirely.
And consumers.
And as we discussed in detail earlier, low-income consumers are significantly impacted because they spend a larger proportion of their income on basic, tradable essentials. Food, clothing, basic goods, tariffs act as that regressive tax, hitting their budgets disproportionately hard.
What about exporters?
Exporters definitely get caught in the crossfire of retaliation. They can suddenly lose access to key foreign markets overnight when another country imposes retaliatory tariffs. That can be devastating for businesses built on exports.
Are some countries hit harder than others overall?
Yes. From a country-specific perspective, the projections suggest our neighbor Canada is likely to bear a substantial brunt of the damage from U.S. tariffs. Their long-run economy is estimated to potentially be 2.1% smaller. That's largely due to how deeply integrated Canadian supply chains are with the U.S. economy.
Minus 2.1%. That's a big hit for Canada. What about China?
China's economy is also projected to be negatively impacted, though maybe less dramatically than Canada's relative to its size, perhaps around 0.2% smaller in the long run. Still a significant drag.
And is there a longer-term risk beyond these immediate impacts?
Yes, there's a significant competitiveness risk that arises from persistent tariffs. If tariffs remain high for a long time, they can essentially lock in higher cost structures within the domestic economy. It just becomes inherently more expensive to produce goods there. This discourages investment in industries that trade internationally, the tradable sector, and ultimately it can erode export competitiveness over time, making it harder and harder for domestic industries to compete effectively on the global stage in the long run. It's a slow, corrosive effect.
Okay, so if these broad blanket tariffs have all these downsides, the unintended consequences, the economic drag, the complex and often unfair distributional impacts, what actually works better? Surely there are smarter tools governments can use beyond just slapping on wide-ranging tariffs.
Oh, absolutely. There's a whole toolkit of more targeted and often more effective approaches. For one, targeted remedies like anti-dumping or countervailing duties can be much more precise.
Anti-dumping and countervailing duties. How are they different?
Anti-dumping duties address cases where foreign companies sell goods below their cost of production or below their home market price. Countervailing duties address cases where foreign governments provide unfair subsidies to their exporters. The key is that these are usually applied only after a thorough investigation, including a clear injury test, meaning you have to demonstrate that the dumping or subsidy is actually harming a domestic industry. And they often include sunset reviews.
Sunset reviews.
Yeah, meaning the duties automatically expire after a set period, maybe 5 years, unless a new review finds they are still needed. This prevents them from becoming permanent, inefficient protectionist measures that outlive their purpose. They target specific unfair practices, causing less collateral damage than broad tariffs.
Okay, that sounds more surgical. What else?
We also talked about price undertakings earlier, especially in the EU-China EV context. To explain that a bit more robustly, instead of country A imposing a tariff on country B's electric vehicles, country B's government or its companies might agree to sell those EVs in country A only at or above a certain minimum price.
Right, the price floor agreement.
It's a way to address concerns about unfair competition, maybe from state subsidies or selling below cost, without triggering a full-blown tariff war. It offers a degree of predictability for businesses and helps stabilize expectations in sensitive sectors like EVs, though, again, it's still a form of managed trade that raises prices.
Are there solutions that don't involve trade barriers at all?
Definitely. And arguably, these are often the most effective long-term strategies. Domestic productivity investment is hugely important, but often overlooked in the tariff debate.
What does that involve?
It's not about taxing imports. It's about making your own industries more competitive from the inside out. This includes things like reforms to streamline permitting processes, making it faster and cheaper to build new factories or infrastructure, investing in energy efficiency and clean energy sources to lower operating costs for businesses.
Okay. Infrastructure, skills.
Absolutely. Modernizing port infrastructure to reduce shipping delays and costs is crucial. And critically, investing in workforce training and education to ensure our labor force has the skills needed for the industries of the future. All these internal improvements can effectively lower the unit costs for domestic industries, making them more competitive globally without taxing consumers or inviting retaliation.
That sounds like a more sustainable approach.
It generally is. Furthermore, actively enhancing supply chain resilience through strategies like friendshoring is gaining traction.
Friendshoring, meaning
Deliberately sourcing more critical goods and components from allied or geopolitically aligned countries, rather than potential adversaries or unreliable partners. It's about building trust and redundancy into supply chains. You can also use specific procurement incentives, government purchasing rules that favor resilient or domestic supply chains. These strategies can build robust and secure supply chains more effectively than just relying on border taxes alone. It's about strategically diversifying sources and strengthening partnerships, not just building walls.
And finally, what about just basic clarity and predictability?
Hugely important. Providing rules, clarity, and time-bound measures is essential. Businesses, honestly, can adapt to almost any trade regime, even if it's not ideal, if it's stable and well-signaled. If they know what the rules are and have some confidence they won't change drastically overnight and maybe know for how long they'll apply, they can make long-term plans. They can make investments with more confidence. That minimizes that costly uncertainty tax we keep talking about. Stability matters immensely.
Okay, so lots of alternative tools available. Which brings us back to the motivations. If these broad tariffs are often counterproductive economically, why do we see them used so much?
Right. To connect all these threads back to the broader picture, what we're really witnessing is that the true drivers of tariffs are often found at this complex intersection of policy, politics, and, frankly, profit incentives in modern media-driven democracies. We can recap the stated motives, right? There's the policy rationale, often framed as an America-first industrial strategy. The goals mentioned are de-risking critical supply chains, bargaining for better trade deals, trying to reshore production back home.
Okay, the official reasons.
Then there's the element of tactical leverage, using tariffs as a tool in negotiations, trying to project strength on the world stage. There's also fiscal and legal signaling involved, pushing the boundaries of executive power, maybe creating political drama. And underlying some of it, there's often a strategic industrial logic, genuinely trying to protect or nurture key sectors like EVs or semiconductors from intense foreign competition or influence.
That covers the policy and political angles.
Yeah.
What about personal gain? You sometimes hear speculation, particularly around President Trump.
Right. Regarding personal gains, it's really important to approach this carefully. We want to look at the plausible mechanisms without, diving into speculative conspiracy theories. We need to stick to what's credibly reported.
Okay, so is there a direct link between the tariffs themselves and Trump's businesses?
A direct link between the tariffs and Trump's core legacy businesses. Real estate, hospitality, golf courses, media ventures. That link appears pretty weak based on the evidence. In fact, if anything, you could argue tariffs might even raise input costs for some of those businesses. Think higher steel prices for construction projects, or maybe higher costs for imported goods used in hotels or restaurants. So there's no hard evidence that tariff settings directly funnel revenue to those specific businesses.
Okay, so no direct funnel. What about indirectly?
Now, there is a highly plausible indirect link, and this is where it gets really fascinating and connects back to the politics. Tariffs and the whole tough on trade stance are absolutely central to Trump's political brand, right?
Yeah, it's a core part of his image.
Exactly. The image of being tough on trade, fighting for America first, being committed to reshoring jobs and manufacturing, it's a powerful brand. And that brand, in turn, can fuel various monetization channels.
Monetization channels, like what?
Well, think about things like memberships and events at Trump properties. These become more valuable, more exclusive perhaps, when tied to this powerful political brand and the access it implies. You see income from media ventures that leverage his platform, sales of merchandise tied to the brand, and significantly, especially in the 2024-2025 period, we've seen a lot of activity around crypto ventures. Things like meme coins, branded tokens, involvement in crypto mining, decentralized finance projects. These often leverage public attention and his strong brand loyalty.
So the tariffs boost the brand, and the brand helps make money in other ways.
That seems to be the plausible mechanism. Credible recent reporting, looking at financial disclosures and other sources, tallies multi-billion-dollar family gains tied to presidential prominence. Now, importantly, this reported wealth increase isn't necessarily attributed to direct tariff revenue itself. It's more about the enhanced value of the Trump brand, maybe improved access to influential networks, potentially advantageous regulatory postures on things like crypto, and just the sheer political attention machine that high-profile policies like tariffs help to power. The value derived from these other channels, like licensing deals for the brand name or the success of crypto projects, often hinges on maintaining that public visibility and political relevance, which tariffs definitely contribute to.
Okay, so let's try and summarize that carefully.
Please. The bottom line seems to be this. Based on available reporting, it appears accurate to say the family's overall wealth and cash flows have risen sharply during and after Trump's return to office. And large components of that increase seem attributed to things like crypto-related ventures and various licensing agreements. But it is not accurate, based on the current public evidence, to say the tariffs themselves directly generated those gains. The relationship seems much more indirect, working through the power of the political brand and the broader policy and media ecosystem effects.
So it underscores that you don't necessarily need a direct quid pro quo or a hidden conspiracy to explain why tariffs might be politically appealing, even if they have economic downsides.
Exactly. We just need to understand that complex, sometimes subtle intersection of genuine policy objectives, however debatable, political expediency and brand building, and the various profit incentives that exist in our modern media-driven democracies. It's a complicated mix. Hashtag tag tag outro.
Wow. Okay. What a truly deep dive into an issue that, as you said, really touches almost every aspect of our economy and our lives. So just to quickly recap the big takeaways for everyone listening, we've seen that tariffs are far, far from simple economic levers, right?
Definitely not simple.
The idea that foreigners pay is largely a myth. The costs are often paid by domestic consumers through higher prices, acting like a regressive tax that hits lower-income households harder. We learned they rarely, if ever, fix trade deficits because those are driven by deeper macroeconomic factors like savings and investment.
Right. They mostly just shuffle trade around.
We saw they have really mixed and often negative impacts on jobs overall. They might help a small upstream sector, but often hurt much larger downstream industries and advanced manufacturing. They almost always invite retaliation from trading partners, creating global instability and trade wars.
Retaliation is the norm now.
The revenue they generate for governments is volatile and unpredictable, especially when you factor in economic slowdowns and legal challenges. And fundamentally, we've seen they are driven by so much more than just pure economics. They're tangled up with geopolitics, national security, domestic political narratives, and even indirect personal branding effects.
A complex brew.
And these unprecedented legal battles we're seeing in 2025 have just added another huge layer of complexity, challenging presidential authority and creating immense uncertainty for businesses all over the world.
So if we try and connect all this to the bigger picture, this whole 2025 tariff saga really shows us, doesn't it, that trade policy isn't just some static economic lever you pull. It's this dynamic, multifaceted tool with profound and often really unforeseen consequences that just ripple through every layer of society. So the question, I think, for you, our listener, to think you ponder is this. As we move forward into what seems like an era of more persistent trade volatility, How will the global economy adapt to these new realities? What's going to be the lasting impact on how nations interact with each other, on how global supply chains get structured or restructured, and ultimately just on how goods are produced and consumed all around the world? It's a landscape that really demands continuous critical thinking, I think, a willingness to look far beyond the easy headlines and the simple explanations, and really an understanding that the policy choices being made today will inevitably shape our economic future for decades to come.